There's a question that historians have been avoiding for over a century and a half. What happens to a man's soul when he's forced to become death itself? When every victory means another human being stops breathing, when survival requires you to perfect the art of killing, when the system gives you only two choices, murder or watch everyone you love suffer consequences worse than death? The answer to that question is buried in the account books of Chambers County, Alabama, hidden in estate records that were sealed for 89 years, and whispered about in testimonies that were deliberately destroyed before they could enter the official record. What we're about to reveal is the story of a man who stepped into makeshift fighting rings 31 times, 31 fights, 31 victories, 31 dead men left behind, and a truth about the antebellum South that makes everything you thought you knew about that period feel incomplete. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to want to remember where you were when you heard this story, because what comes next changes everything. The story doesn't begin with violence. It begins with a woman's scream cutting through a humid Georgia night in August of 1839. The midwife, working in the quarters of the Thornhill plantation near Milledgeville, delivered a baby boy who was, according to her later testimony, the largest infant she'd seen in 40 years of bringing enslaved children into this world. The mother was a woman named Esther, 19 years old, who'd been purchased 2 years earlier from a plantation in the Carolinas. The father's identity was never recorded in any official document, though everyone on the plantation understood certain truths that were never spoken aloud. The baby was given the name Isaiah, a biblical reference chosen by Thornhill's wife, who fancied herself a religious woman despite presiding over a system built on the systematic destruction of human dignity. That name would appear in property ledgers for the next 14 years, always in the same category as livestock and farm equipment, never acknowledged as belonging to a human being with thoughts and feelings and a future that should have been his own to determine. Isaiah grew, not normally, but with a kind of relentless physical development that made overseers nervous and other enslaved people watchful. By age 10, he stood as tall as grown men. By 12, he was working alongside adults in the cotton fields, matching their output despite his youth. By 14, he'd reached his full height of 6 feet 5 inches, towering over virtually everyone on the plantation, white or black. His body had developed the kind of dense, functional muscle that came from years of brutal labor under the Alabama sun. But it was something else that made Isaiah different, something that couldn't be measured in height or weight or physical capacity. He watched people, studied them, learned to read their intentions in the way they moved, the tone of their voices, the things they said when they thought no one important was listening. He understood, earlier than most enslaved people ever did, that information was power in a world designed to keep him powerless. That knowledge would become his most dangerous weapon, far more than his fists would ever be. The Thornhill plantation sat on 2,800 acres of prime Alabama cottonland, worked by 147 enslaved people whose names appeared in inventory lists right between the property's mules and its farm implements. James Thornhill himself was a second-generation planter, 41 years old in 1853, with a reputation for business acumen that bordered on ruthlessness. He'd inherited 900 acres from his father and expanded through calculated investments and strategic marriages that gave him access to capital most men his age couldn't touch. He was known throughout Chambers County as a man who maximized profit from every asset, who squeezed productivity from his land and his human property with equal efficiency. But Thornhill had a weakness that he'd learned to hide from his business associates and family. He gambled, not on cards or dice, which would have been socially acceptable among men of his class, but on blood sports that operated in the shadows of polite society. He attended cockfights in secret locations across 3 counties. He wagered enormous sums on dogfights that wealthy planters organized in barns and clearings, far from any authority that might object. He'd even traveled to New Orleans twice to watch bare-knuckle boxing matches between Irish immigrants who fought for purses that could change their lives if they survived long enough to spend the winnings. It was during one of these trips to New Orleans in the spring of 1853 that Thornhill witnessed something that would set everything else in motion. A fight between 2 enslaved men, arranged by their owners, that drew a crowd of more than 200 spectators and generated betting that exceeded $3,000. The fight lasted 19 minutes and ended with one man dead and the other barely able to stand. But what captured Thornhill's attention wasn't the violence itself, it was the money. The winner's owner collected a purse of $400 plus his own successful wagers, walking away with nearly $900 from a single fight, more than most plantations generated in profit during an entire season. Thornhill returned to Alabama with an idea that would consume him for the next year. He had access to raw material, 147 enslaved people whose bodies he owned absolutely. He had connections throughout the region, other planters who shared his appetite for blood sports and gambling. He had capital to invest in developing the right fighter. All he needed was to identify which of his human property had the potential to become what he was looking for, a weapon that could generate profit through violence. He spent 3 months observing the enslaved workers on his plantation, watching them during their labor, studying how they moved, how they responded to stress, how they handled the casual violence that was woven into every aspect of plantation life. He tested them with tasks designed to reveal their physical capabilities and their psychological resilience. He pushed them to their limits and watched to see who broke and who endured. Most broke. That was expected, even desired in the normal operations of a plantation. Broken people were easier to control, less likely to resist, more likely to accept their circumstances as inevitable. But Thornhill wasn't looking for broken people. He was looking for someone who could be shaped into something else entirely. He found what he was looking for in Isaiah. Not because Isaiah was the strongest, though his physical development was extraordinary. Not because he was the most aggressive, because he wasn't. Isaiah had learned early to control his responses, to present a facade of compliance that kept overseers from singling him out for punishment. What caught Thornhill's attention was something he observed one September afternoon when an overseer named Caleb Marsh decided to assert his authority in front of other workers. Marsh was new to the plantation, hired 3 weeks earlier, and he'd been told by more experienced overseers that Isaiah was someone to handle carefully. Marsh took this as a challenge to his authority. He engineered a situation where Isaiah would fail at an impossible task, then prepared to administer punishment that would establish who was in control. He ordered Isaiah to move a cart loaded with cotton bales that normally required 2 mules to pull. Isaiah looked at the cart, looked at Marsh, and in that moment Thornhill saw something flash across the young man's face. Not anger, not fear, but calculation. Pure, cold assessment of the situation, the consequences, the options available. Isaiah walked to the cart, positioned himself, and pulled. The cart didn't move. Marsh raised his whip, satisfaction evident in his expression. But before the whip could fall, Isaiah adjusted his position slightly and pulled again. The cart moved. Not easily, not quickly, but it moved. Inch by inch, foot by foot, Isaiah pulled that cart across 50 yards of dirt road, while every other worker stopped what they were doing to watch. By the time he finished, his hands were bleeding, his shoulders showed rope burns through his shirt, and his breathing came in controlled gasps that suggested he was operating at the absolute limit of human endurance. But the cart had moved. The task had been completed. Marsh couldn't punish him without looking foolish. Thornhill watched this entire exchange from the porch of his plantation house. What he'd witnessed wasn't just physical strength, though that was impressive. It was the decision-making process that had played out in those few seconds before Isaiah chose to attempt the impossible rather than accept the whip. It was the calculation that said surviving this moment with dignity intact was worth the physical cost. It was the refusal to be broken, even when breaking would have been easier. That night, Thornhill made a decision that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives and contribute to a death toll that still haunts the historical record. He would turn Isaiah into a fighter. Not through the crude methods that other planters might use, not through simple brutality and forced violence, but through a more sophisticated approach that recognized what Isaiah actually was. Not property that could be simply commanded, but a human being with motivations that could be manipulated if you understood what those motivations were. Thornhill spent 2 weeks learning everything he could about Isaiah's life on the plantation. He discovered that Isaiah's mother, Esther, still lived in the quarters, though her health had deteriorated after years of fieldwork and multiple miscarriages. He learned that Isaiah had formed a quiet attachment to a young woman named Ruth who worked in the plantation house. He found out about an older man called Abraham who taught Isaiah to read in secret, a capital offense that could result in severe punishment for both teacher and student if discovered. He identified a boy of perhaps 8 named Daniel, who followed Isaiah around whenever his own work allowed, looking at him with the kind of worship that suggested Isaiah had become a surrogate father figure. These weren't just pieces of information. They were leverage, pressure points that could be used to ensure compliance when simple commands would fail. Thornhill understood human nature well enough to know that threatening Isaiah directly would be useless. A man willing to pull an impossibly heavy cart rather than accept a whipping wasn't going to be controlled by threats to his own well-being, but threatening the people he cared about? That was different. That gave Thornhill the control he needed. The conversation happened on October 3rd, 1853, in Thornhill's study, a room that enslaved people were never normally allowed to enter. Isaiah was brought in by 2 overseers who were told to wait outside, and for the first time in his life he found himself alone in a room with the man who owned him, surrounded by books and furniture and comfort that existed in a completely different world from the quarters where he slept on a dirt floor. Thornhill didn't waste time with preamble. He explained exactly what he wanted. Isaiah would fight other enslaved men in arranged contests. He would fight to win, meaning he would fight without mercy, without hesitation, without allowing any sense of compassion or humanity to interfere with the singular goal of defeating his opponent by any means necessary. He would train, would follow instructions about diet and preparation, would present himself at designated times and locations to perform this service. In exchange, certain people on the plantation would receive protection and privileges. Esther would be moved from field work to lighter duties in the plantation house. Ruth would be given her own cabin and exemption from the sexual predations that house servants normally endured. Abraham would be allowed to keep teaching, would even be given books that Thornhill would provide discreetly. Daniel would be apprenticed to the plantation's blacksmith rather than sent to the fields when he came of age. But if Isaiah refused, or if he lost even a single fight, these same people would suffer consequences that Thornhill described with clinical precision. Esther would be sold to a plantation in Mississippi where the mortality rate for field workers exceeded 40% within 5 years. Ruth would be given to the overseers with explicit permission to use her however they wanted. Abraham would be reported to authorities for the crime of teaching enslaved people to read, resulting in public whipping that would likely kill a man his age. Daniel would be sold to a mine operation in Tennessee, where boys his age typically survived less than 2 years. Thornhill laid out these terms without emotion, watching Isaiah's face for reactions, measuring the impact of each threat. He saw what he was looking for. A kind of stillness that indicated absolute focus, complete understanding of the stakes involved. When he finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Isaiah asked one question: "How many fights?" "As many as it takes," Thornhill answered. "Until I decide we're done." Isaiah's response was 3 words: "I'll do it." The training began the next morning in a tobacco barn on the far edge of Thornhill's property, away from the main plantation buildings, away from the eyes of overseers who might ask uncomfortable questions about why valuable field labor was being redirected to something that generated no immediate productivity. Thornhill had thought through the logistics with the same meticulous attention he brought to every business venture. He brought in a man named Jack Dempsey, a former bare-knuckle fighter from Savannah who'd won 14 matches before age and accumulated injuries ended his career. Dempsey was white, poor, and willing to take Thornhill's money without asking questions about why a wealthy planter wanted to train an enslaved man to fight. The arrangement paid Dempsey more than he could earn in 6 months of ordinary labor. In exchange, he was expected to transform raw physical potential into something that could win fights against men who'd been training for exactly this purpose their entire lives. Dempsey assessed Isaiah with the practical eye of someone who understood violence as a craft rather than simple brutality. He walked around him, studying his proportions, his stance, the way his weight distributed. He had Isaiah throw punches at the air, watching the mechanics of his movement. He tested reflexes with sudden movements designed to provoke instinctive responses. After 20 minutes of this examination, Dempsey turned to Thornhill with an expression somewhere between impressed and troubled. "This one's got natural talent," he said. "The reach, the power, the way he moves for his size. But that's not what wins fights." "What wins fights?" Thornhill asked. "The willingness to keep hitting when every instinct says to stop. The capacity to absorb punishment that would drop normal men and keep moving forward. The understanding that in the ring, hesitation is death." Dempsey looked back at Isaiah, who stood perfectly still, watching this conversation about him as if he were furniture being appraised. "The question is whether he's got that in him. Whether he can access the part of himself that's willing to do what's necessary." "We're going to find out," Thornhill said. The training was systematic and brutal. Dempsey had Isaiah running before dawn, building the kind of cardiovascular endurance that would let him fight for extended periods without his body betraying him. He taught basic technique, how to throw a punch with maximum force while minimizing the risk of breaking your own hand, how to protect vulnerable areas while maintaining offensive capability, how to read an opponent's movements and anticipate their strategy. But more importantly, he taught psychology. Fighting wasn't just about physical capacity. It was about understanding fear, pain, exhaustion, and learning to function when all 3 were screaming at you to stop. It was about recognizing the moment when your opponent's will began to crack and knowing how to exploit that fracture with ruthless efficiency. Dempsey had Isaiah spar against a heavy bag he'd constructed from canvas and sand, teaching him to aim for specific targets that would accumulate damage over the course of a fight. He explained which strikes would slow an opponent down, which would disable specific capabilities, which would end a fight definitively if landed correctly. He spoke about violence, with the casual familiarity of someone discussing farming techniques, reducing human destruction to a series of technical problems with known solutions. Isaiah absorbed everything with the same focused intensity he brought to all forms of learning. He asked questions that revealed unexpected strategic sophistication. How do you fight someone taller than you? What do you do when you're injured early and have to continue anyway? How can you tell when an opponent is faking weakness to draw you into a trap? Dempsey answered these questions, sometimes with surprise at their insight, and gradually came to understand that he wasn't training a simple fighter. He was training someone who approached violence as a puzzle to be solved, who understood that survival in this new arena would require intelligence at least as much as strength. 3 months into the training, Dempsey pulled Thornhill aside and told him something that would prove prophetic. "This boy's going to win fights, lots of them. But you need to understand something. Every victory is going to change him in ways you can't predict or control. Men who kill for a living, even when they're forced into it, don't stay the same. Something in them gets altered at a fundamental level. You're creating something you might not be able to manage when this is over. Thornhill dismissed the warning. He'd made his investment and intended to see returns on it. The first fight was arranged for January 19th, 1854, on a plantation near Opelika, owned by a man named Richard Colquitt. Colquitt had heard through the network of wealthy planters who shared information about their various entertainments that Thornhill had acquired a fighter worth seeing. He proposed a modest contest, a test to determine whether Isaiah had genuine potential or was just another physically impressive enslaved man who would fold under actual combat conditions. The purse was $100, relatively small by the standards that would develop later, but significant enough to make the evening worthwhile for both men. Colquitt's fighter was a man named Sampson, 28 years old, who'd won 3 previous fights against opponents from neighboring plantations. Sampson had killed one of those opponents, a detail that Colquitt mentioned with the same casual tone he might use to discuss a particularly successful cotton harvest. The fight was to take place in a clearing behind Colquitt's property, marked with torches, observed by perhaps 30 spectators who represented the planter elite of Lee County and the western edge of Chambers County. Isaiah arrived at the clearing just after sunset, brought by Thornhill and 2 overseers in a wagon that also carried rope, medical supplies, and a shotgun that wouldn't be needed for the fight itself, but sent a clear message about what would happen if Isaiah tried to run. It was the first time he'd left Thornhill's plantation in his 14 years of life, the first time he'd seen the world beyond the property lines that had defined his entire existence. The journey had taken them through pine forests and past other plantations, where enslaved people worked in fields that looked identical to the ones he knew. The sameness of it all, the repetition of this system across thousands of acres, hundreds of properties, an entire region built on the systematic exploitation of human beings who looked like him, created a kind of crushing awareness of scale. This wasn't just Thornhill's operation. This was everywhere. This was everything. This was the world as it existed, and fighting in a clearing for the entertainment of men who considered him property was just one more variation on the fundamental theme of his life. The ring itself was nothing more than a space cleared of underbrush, roughly circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter. The ground was hard-packed dirt, still slightly damp from recent rain, which would make footing treacherous. Torches driven into the ground at intervals created shadows that jumped and flickered across the assembled crowd. The spectators stood in loose groupings, talking among themselves, passing flasks of whiskey, placing bets with the casual ease of men wagering on something of no real consequence. Their enslaved workers stood further back, brought along to handle equipment, to serve refreshments, to provide labor, but also to watch. To see what happened to people like them when they were placed in rings and told to fight for the amusement of their owners. That witnessing served a purpose beyond entertainment. It reinforced the fundamental message of the system: your body is not your own, your life is not your own, you exist to serve purposes that others determine, and resistance only brings worse suffering. Sampson was already in the ring when Isaiah arrived, moving through warm-up exercises that demonstrated both experience and confidence. He was shorter than Isaiah, perhaps 6 feet tall, but built with the dense muscle that came from years of labor and previous fights. His face carried scars that testified to violence survived, and his eyes held the particular quality of someone who'd learned to shut off parts of himself in order to do terrible things and still sleep at night. He watched Isaiah approach with assessment rather than concern, seeing a young opponent with size but no experience, calculating that this would be a short fight that would add to his growing reputation. The rules were explained by Colquitt himself, who clearly enjoyed this ceremonial aspect of the proceedings. The fight would continue until one man could no longer stand or defend himself. No weapons would be permitted beyond the fighter's own bodies. The winner's owner would collect the purse and any personal wagers he'd placed. The loser would be removed from the ring in whatever condition the fight left him, with no guarantee of medical treatment or recovery. Isaiah stood in the ring, his heart pounding with an intensity that made him worry the spectators could hear it, and understood with absolute clarity that he was about to kill a man or die himself. There was no third option. Samson had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. The system had shaped him into exactly what it needed, a weapon that could be pointed at other enslaved people to create entertainment for white men who controlled everything. Isaiah had two choices: become the same thing or watch everyone he cared about suffer consequences worse than death. The fight began with a gesture from Colquitt, a simple lowering of his hand that transformed two human beings into combatants whose only value lay in their capacity to destroy each other. Samson moved first, closing the distance with practiced efficiency, landing a combination of strikes that tested Isaiah's defenses and established his own superior experience. The punches landed with force that Isaiah had never experienced in training, real violence delivered with intent to cause maximum damage, and the pain was immediate and clarifying. This was different from sparring with heavy bags. This was a human being trying to hurt him, trying to disable him, trying ultimately to kill him. Isaiah responded the way Dempsey had trained him to respond. He protected his head, absorbed the body blows that couldn't be avoided, and waited for openings that his opponent's aggression would inevitably create. Samson was skilled, but he fought with a pattern that revealed itself over the first 2 minutes. He liked combinations, 3 or 4 strikes in rapid succession, designed to overwhelm defenses and create opportunities for a finishing blow. He favored his right hand, putting more power into those strikes at the cost of leaving his left side slightly more exposed. He had a tell, a subtle shift in his weight that preceded his most powerful attacks, visible if you knew to look for it. Isaiah absorbed punishment that opened cuts above both his eyes and likely cracked at least one rib, learning Samson's patterns with the same focused intensity he brought to all forms of study, understanding that this education was being delivered in blood and pain, but was no less valuable for that. The fight shifted in the 4th minute, when Isaiah finally landed a solid strike to Samson's ribs, putting his full weight and reach advantage into a blow that produced an audible crack. Samson's expression changed, surprise and pain breaking through the controlled focus he'd maintained. He'd expected this to be quick, expected the younger fighter to fold under sustained pressure, expected an easy victory that would add to his reputation without serious cost. The realization that Isaiah was actually dangerous, that this might be a real fight rather than a simple demonstration of dominance, altered Samson's approach. He became more cautious, more defensive, which created exactly the openings Isaiah had been waiting for. The next 3 minutes saw the momentum shift decisively. Isaiah used his height and reach to control distance, landing strikes that accumulated damage while staying outside the range where Samson's superior technical skill gave him advantages. He targeted the injured ribs systematically, understanding that pain compounds over time, that each blow to the same area makes the next blow more effective. He watched for the tell that preceded Samson's power strikes and countered before they could fully develop. The crowd's noise had changed from casual conversation to focused attention. They were seeing something unexpected, a first-time fighter not just surviving, but actually winning against an experienced opponent. Money changed hands as spectators adjusted their bets, some doubling down on their original choices, others switching sides as the fight's outcome became less certain. Thornhill stood at the ring's edge, his face revealing nothing, but his hands were clenched with tension that suggested he understood how much was riding on this fight. Not just the purse, not just the wages, but the entire enterprise he'd invested in. If Isaiah lost tonight, the whole project would be revealed as a failed experiment. If he won, possibilities opened up that extended far beyond this single clearing. The fight lasted 11 minutes total. It ended when Isaiah landed a strike to Samson's temple, a blow that used his full reach and power, connecting with the precision that Dempsey had drilled into him over 3 months of relentless training. Samson dropped immediately, his body going rigid before collapsing into the dirt. The crowd went silent, that particular quality of silence that indicated they'd witnessed something significant. The plantation doctor, a man named Williams, who attended these events for extra income and the entertainment value, rushed forward to examine Samson. His assessment took perhaps 30 seconds. Dead. Massive trauma to the head. Williams announced this with the clinical detachment of someone reporting findings that had no real emotional significance, and the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some spectators cheered, celebrating successful wagers or simply the dramatic conclusion to an unexpectedly competitive fight. Others looked troubled, perhaps recognizing that they'd just watched a human being die for their entertainment, perhaps calculating the financial loss this represented for Colquitt, perhaps wondering about their own fighters and what this new competitor might mean for future contests. Colquitt himself looked stunned, staring at Sampson's body with an expression that suggested he was calculating not grief but lost investment. Sampson had represented years of development and multiple successful fights, generating income and prestige that had made the investment worthwhile. Now that asset was gone, destroyed in 11 minutes by an untested opponent who just entered the arena. Isaiah stood in the center of the ring, his chest heaving, blood running down his face from cuts above his eyes, and experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even relief that he'd survived, just a crushing awareness of what he'd become in the span of 11 minutes. He'd killed a man, not in self-defense, not in some spontaneous act of violence, but in a calculated, systematic way that used training and technique to end another human being's life. Sampson had been enslaved just like him, had been forced into this ring just like him, had been fighting for reasons that probably mirrored his own, protecting people he cared about or surviving in a system that gave him no better choices. And now Sampson was dead, his body cooling in the Alabama dirt, because Isaiah had done exactly what Thornhill wanted him to do. Thornhill collected the purse, $100, plus another $150 from personal wages, and approached Isaiah with satisfaction barely concealed. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than I expected for a first fight. This is just the beginning." Then he gestured to the overseers, who led Isaiah back to the wagon for the journey home. The return trip happened in silence. Isaiah sat in the wagon bed, his hands bound as a precaution Thornhill had decided to implement, and watched the pine forests pass in the darkness. His mind was replaying the fight, analyzing what he'd done right, what he'd done wrong, what he'd learned that might keep him alive in whatever came next. But underneath that tactical assessment was something else. A question that had no comfortable answer. What happens to a person who becomes skilled at killing? Dempsey had warned Thornhill about this, had said that victories would change Isaiah in unpredictable ways. But even Dempsey couldn't have anticipated the specific form that change would take. Isaiah understood with absolute clarity that he'd crossed a threshold. The boy who'd pulled an impossible cart rather than accept a whipping still existed somewhere inside him, but layered over that person was something new. Someone who knew exactly how much force it took to crack ribs, where to strike to cause maximum damage, what a man's face looked like in the moment before death. That knowledge couldn't be unlearned. That person couldn't be unmade. From this night forward, Isaiah would carry the weight of Sampson's death and whatever deaths followed, and there was no power on earth that could change that fact. When they arrived back at the plantation, it was well past midnight. Thornhill had the overseers take Isaiah to a small cabin that had been prepared for him, separate from the quarters where other enslaved people lived. The cabin was modest, just one room with a bed, a table, and a chair, but it represented privileges that field workers could never expect. Isaiah was given water to clean himself and a meal that was better than the standard rations. His injuries were examined by the plantation's doctor, who bandaged the cuts and confirmed that while the rib was likely cracked, it would heal if given proper rest. All of this was calculated. Thornhill understood that maintaining his investment required better treatment than field workers received, that a fighter needed nutrition and recovery time that ordinary enslaved people couldn't access. But it was also isolation. Isaiah was being separated from the community he'd known his entire life, being transformed into something different, something apart, something that existed in a category all its own. The next morning, Esther was moved from fieldwork to duties in the plantation house, just as Thornhill had promised. Ruth was given her own cabin and protection from the sexual predations that house servants normally endured. Abraham was quietly given a book on mathematics and told he could continue teaching without fear of consequences. Daniel was told he would apprentice with the blacksmith when he turned 10. Every promise was kept with meticulous precision. Thornhill understood that the bargain only worked if both sides upheld their obligations, that Isaiah would only continue to fight if he believed the people he cared about were genuinely protected. But there was a cruelty embedded in this arrangement that went beyond the fighting itself. Every privilege those people received, every protection they enjoyed, came at the cost of Isaiah killing other human beings. Their improved circumstances were purchased with blood, built on corpses, maintained through systematic violence that destroyed Isaiah a little bit more with each fight. They knew this, understood it with painful clarity, but had no power to refuse the benefits they were being given. The system had found a way to turn even love into a weapon, to make human connection into a tool of control. Over the next 6 weeks, Isaiah fought 3 more times. Fight 2 was against a man named Jupiter on February 14, 1854, near Columbus. Jupiter had won 5 previous fights and was considered one of the best fighters in the region. The fight lasted 16 minutes and ended with Jupiter dead from accumulated head trauma. Fight 3 was against a man called Hercules on March 3rd, near Auburn. Hercules had killed 4 previous opponents and fought with a savagery that suggested he'd learned to channel rage into technique. The fight lasted 23 minutes and ended with Hercules unable to continue, his body shutting down from damage that the plantation doctor said would likely kill him within days. The doctor was right. Hercules died on March 6th. Fight 4 was against a man named Titan on March 28th, near Tuskegee. Titan was enormous, 6 feet 7 inches tall, weighing perhaps 260 pounds, with a reputation that had spread across 3 counties. The fight lasted 19 minutes and ended with Titan dead before his body hit the ground, killed by a strike to the temple that everyone present recognized as Isaiah's signature finishing technique. 4 fights, 4 victories, 4 dead men. Thornhill collected purses totaling $450, plus personal wages that brought his total profit to nearly $800. More money than most Alabama families would see in 2 years, generated in less than 3 months. He reinvested some of this capital into the plantation, purchased new equipment, expanded his operations. But most of it went into a separate account, building a fund that he intended to use for future investments in this enterprise. He began making connections with other wealthy planters throughout Alabama and into Georgia and Mississippi, letting them know he had a fighter worth seeing, building anticipation for future contests. He raised his prices, demanding larger purses, negotiating more favorable terms. The supply of willing opponents seemed inexhaustible. Throughout the region, other planters had been developing their own fighters, investing in enslaved men who they believed could win contests that would generate profit and prestige. Some of these fighters had extensive experience, had won multiple fights, had killed before, and would kill again without hesitation. Matching them against Isaiah became a test of investment strategies, a way for wealthy men to prove their judgment and acumen through the performance of human beings they owned. Absolutely. But something was developing that went beyond simple profit calculations. Isaiah was becoming known. Among enslaved populations throughout the region, stories were beginning to circulate about the fighter who couldn't be beaten, who'd won every fight, who stood 6 feet 5 inches tall and moved with controlled power that seemed almost supernatural. The details were embellished in each retelling, creating a legend that exceeded the factual reality but served important purposes for the communities that told these stories. Here was evidence that strength could be maintained even under circumstances designed to break it, that survival was possible even in the system's darkest corners, that enslaved people could develop capabilities that made even their owners nervous. These stories offered something desperately needed: hope that resistance might take forms beyond simple endurance, that power could be accumulated even by people who supposedly had none. Thornhill recognized this development and calculated that it served his interests. A legendary fighter drew larger crowds, commanded higher purses, generated more profit. He encouraged the mystique, allowed rumors to spread without correction, understood that Isaiah's growing reputation was a business asset worth cultivating. What he failed to recognize, or chose to ignore, was that legends operate according to their own logic. Once created, they can't be fully controlled by the people who initiated them. The story of Isaiah was spreading beyond Thornhill's ability to manage, taking on meanings he never intended, serving purposes that had nothing to do with his profit margins. Fight 5 happened on April 22, 1854, on a plantation near Lafayette in Georgia, and it marked the first time Isaiah faced an opponent who'd been specifically trained to counter his fighting style. The opponent was a man named Caesar, belonging to a planter named William Hutchinson, who'd made a study of Isaiah's previous fights. Hutchinson had interviewed spectators, gathered descriptions of techniques, identified patterns in how Isaiah moved and struck. He'd spent 2 months training Caesar to exploit what he believed were weaknesses in Isaiah's approach, investing time and resources into creating a fighter who could finally hand Thornhill's prodigy his first defeat. The purse was $300, but the side betting exceeded $2,000, as planters throughout the region chose sides in what was being promoted as the fight that would determine whether Isaiah was genuinely unbeatable or just well matched against inferior opponents. Caesar was 32 years old, experienced and utterly ruthless. He'd won 9 previous fights, killing 6 opponents and leaving the other 3 so damaged they never fought again. He fought with a style that emphasized defense and counterattacking, waiting for opponents to commit to strikes and then exploiting the openings their aggression created. Hutchinson had studied Isaiah's tendency to use his reach advantage to control distance and had trained Caesar to nullify that advantage by forcing close-quarters combat where technique mattered more than physical attributes. The fight began at dusk in a clearing surrounded by nearly 80 spectators, the largest crowd Isaiah had faced. The atmosphere was different from previous fights, charged with anticipation that went beyond normal entertainment. People had traveled from 3 states to watch this contest, to see whether the legend building around Isaiah would be confirmed or shattered. For the first 8 minutes, the fight proceeded exactly as Hutchinson had planned. Caesar forced close combat, negated Isaiah's reach, landed combinations that opened cuts and accumulated damage with systematic efficiency. He fought with patience that suggested absolute confidence, knowing that time favored the more experienced fighter, understanding that Isaiah's youth and relative inexperience would eventually create mistakes that could be exploited. The crowd's noise reflected this dynamic, Hutchinson's supporters cheering each successful strike, Thornhill's allies growing quieter as their investment appeared increasingly vulnerable. Isaiah absorbed punishment that should have ended the fight multiple times, but something had changed in him over 4 previous victories. He'd learned to function through pain that would disable normal men, had developed a capacity to continue when every physical signal screamed at him to stop, but more than that, he'd begun to understand something about fighting that went deeper than technique or physical capability. The shift happened in the 9th minute when Isaiah stopped trying to fight Caesar's fight and instead created his own. He let Caesar close distance, absorbed 2 brutal combinations, and used that apparent weakness to draw his opponent into overcommitting. When Caesar launched what should have been a finishing assault, Isaiah was ready. He countered with a strike to Caesar's throat that caused immediate respiratory distress, following with a combination to the ribs that cracked bone and compromised Caesar's ability to defend himself effectively. The fight's momentum reversed in seconds, Caesar's carefully executed strategy collapsing under the realization that Isaiah had been learning throughout the entire contest, adapting in real time, understanding Caesar's patterns and developing counters faster than seemed humanly possible. The fight lasted 14 minutes total. It ended with Caesar unable to breathe properly, his windpipe damaged, his body shutting down from oxygen deprivation and accumulated trauma. He died 3 minutes after the fight concluded, struggling for air while the plantation doctor worked frantically to save him. Thornhill collected $300 in purse money, plus nearly $600 from personal wagers. But something about this fight troubled him in ways the previous victories hadn't. Isaiah had won, as expected, but the way he'd adapted during the fight, the speed with which he'd analyzed Caesar's strategy and developed counters, suggested capabilities that went beyond what Thornhill had anticipated or trained for. After the fight, during the wagon ride back to the plantation, Thornhill asked a question that revealed his growing unease. "How did you know what to do? How did you figure out his strategy that quickly?" Isaiah's response was quiet, but carried implications that would haunt Thornhill for years. "I watched him. Same way I watch everyone. You learn patterns when survival depends on it. You see things that other people miss because they're not paying the same kind of attention. Fighting teaches you that everything is information, every movement, every choice, every hesitation. You just have to know how to read it." The fights continued with relentless momentum. Fight 6 against a man named Atlas near Montgomery ended in 18 minutes, with Atlas dead from head trauma. Fight 7 against Goliath near Selma lasted 21 minutes and concluded with Goliath's neck broken from a fall that Isaiah had engineered with calculated precision. Fight 8 against Achilles near Tuskegee went 16 minutes and ended with Achilles bleeding internally, dying 2 days later despite the doctor's efforts. Each fight added to Isaiah's reputation and to the body count that was beginning to trouble even the planters who profited from these contests. By the summer of 1854, Isaiah had fought 8 times in 6 months, 8 victories, 8 dead opponents, and a growing legend that was spreading far beyond Alabama's borders. Thornhill was collecting an average of $500 per fight in combined purses and winnings, extraordinary profit that had made him one of the wealthiest planters in Chambers County. But wealth came with complications that money couldn't solve. The first complication was law enforcement beginning to ask questions. Too many deaths, too many suspicious circumstances, too many rumors about illegal fighting operations that were generating substantial unreported income for the region's planter elite. Local sheriffs started investigating, not because they cared about enslaved people dying, but because the fights represented a challenge to official authority and potentially untaxed economic activity. Thornhill and other planters involved in the enterprise had to become more careful about locations, timing, and who was invited to attend. Fights moved deeper into isolated areas, happened with less advance notice, involved more restricted guest lists. Security increased, with armed men positioned to ensure that unwanted observers didn't witness or report what was happening. These precautions added complexity and cost, but were necessary to keep the enterprise operating. The second complication was the effect on enslaved populations throughout the region. Isaiah's legend was inspiring resistance that plantation owners found increasingly difficult to manage. Workers who'd never shown defiance before began testing boundaries, speaking with less deference, performing labor with less complete submission. It was subtle, not open rebellion that could be crushed with immediate violence, but a shift in attitude that suggested people were internalizing a dangerous message. The system could be resisted. Strength could be maintained. Survival was possible even under circumstances designed to break you. Overseers reported difficulties that they couldn't quite articulate, sensing that control was eroding in ways that whips and punishment couldn't fully address. Planters discussed the problem at social gatherings, trying to develop strategies to counteract this influence without fully acknowledging what was happening. The third complication was Isaiah himself. With each fight, with each victory, with each dead man left behind, something in him was changing in ways that went beyond Thornhill's ability to predict or control. He was becoming harder, more distant, less responsive to normal human interaction. The people he'd fought to protect, Esther, Ruth, Abraham, Daniel, they still received the privileges Thornhill had promised, but Isaiah's relationship with them had fundamentally altered. He visited them rarely, spoke in brief sentences when he did, maintained an emotional distance that suggested he was protecting them from something, perhaps from the reality of what he'd become. Esther tried to reach the son, she remembered, the boy who'd pulled an impossible cart rather than accept a whipping, but that person was receding behind layers of violence and death that couldn't be penetrated with maternal love alone. Ruth watched Isaiah with an expression that mixed care with something approaching fear, understanding that the man she'd developed feelings for was being systematically destroyed by circumstances neither of them could control. Abraham, who'd taught Isaiah to read, who'd given him tools for intellectual development, now saw those same analytical capabilities being used to perfect techniques for killing human beings with maximum efficiency. Daniel, who'd worshipped Isaiah as a surrogate father, now looked at him with confusion and growing awareness that adulthood in this system meant impossible choices and moral compromises that childhood couldn't comprehend. They were all trapped in the same terrible bargain. Their protection came at the cost of Isaiah's humanity. Their improved circumstances were built on corpses, and refusing those benefits would mean Isaiah's sacrifices served no purpose at all. Fight 9 happened on August 3rd, 1854, and it marked a turning point in ways that wouldn't become fully clear until much later. The opponent was a man named Hannibal, belonging to a planter named Samuel Teague from Mississippi. Hannibal had won 14 fights across 4 states, killing 11 opponents, and was widely considered the most dangerous fighter in the entire region. The purse was $600, the highest yet, with total betting exceeding $3,000. More than 120 spectators gathered in a clearing near the Alabama-Mississippi border, creating the largest crowd Isaiah had ever faced. The atmosphere carried a carnival quality, wealthy planters treating this as a social event, bringing food and fine liquor, making a celebration out of 2 human beings being forced to try to kill each other for entertainment. Hannibal was 36 years old, built like a monument, covered in scars that testified to fights survived and violence endured. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered an opponent he couldn't ultimately defeat. The fight lasted 31 minutes, the longest yet, and both men were operating at levels that transcended normal human capacity. Hannibal fought with every technique he'd learned across 14 previous victories, using experience and skill that should have overwhelmed a younger opponent who'd only been fighting for 6 months. But Isaiah had been learning at an accelerated rate that defied normal development curves. Each fight taught him things that other fighters took years to understand. Each opponent revealed patterns and strategies that he integrated into his own evolving approach. By the 20-minute mark, both men were bleeding from multiple cuts, breathing in ragged gasps that suggested damaged ribs or worse, operating on reserves of will that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary human strength. The crowd had gone quiet, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, 2 fighters pushing each other to absolute limits, neither willing to yield despite punishment that should have ended the contest multiple times. The fight concluded when Isaiah landed a combination of strikes that dropped Hannibal to his knees. The final blow came when Hannibal tried to rise, a strike to the base of his skull that produced the distinctive sound everyone who attended these fights had learned to recognize. Hannibal collapsed forward and didn't move. The plantation doctor pronounced him dead within seconds. Isaiah stood in the center of the ring, swaying, barely able to remain upright, and for the first time, spectators saw something in his expression that made several men step backward involuntarily. Not rage, not satisfaction, not even exhaustion, but a kind of terrible emptiness, as if something essential had finally been hollowed out and could never be replaced. Thornhill collected his winnings, $600 in purse money plus nearly $900 from personal wagers, and approached Isaiah with unusual caution. "That was the hardest fight you've had," he said quietly. "I know you're hurt. We'll take a month before the next one, let you heal properly." Isaiah's response was unexpected and troubling. "There is no healing from this. You understand that, right? Every fight takes something that doesn't grow back. Every man I kill leaves a mark that doesn't fade. You're getting rich, but what am I becoming?" Thornhill had no answer for that. He'd created this enterprise, invested in this fighter, generated extraordinary profit from systematic violence, but he'd never seriously considered the question of what happened to the human being forced to perform these services. The ride back to the plantation happened in silence, and when they arrived, Isaiah went to his cabin and didn't emerge for 3 days. When he finally did, Esther came to speak with him, tried to offer comfort or connection or something that might reach past the walls he'd constructed. She found her son sitting on the cabin's small porch, staring at nothing, and when he looked at her, she saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. He'd become what the system needed him to become, and there was no path back to the boy he'd been. The fights continued because they had to continue, because stopping would mean the bargain was broken, and the people Isaiah fought to protect would suffer consequences worse than death. Fight 10 against Prometheus near Columbus lasted 19 minutes and ended with Prometheus dead from internal bleeding. Fight 11 against Perseus near Auburn went 22 minutes and concluded with Perseus's spine damaged beyond recovery, dying 4 days later. Fight 12 against Odysseus near Tuskegee lasted 17 minutes and ended with Odysseus unconscious, never waking, dying 3 weeks later without regaining awareness. 13 fights, 13 victories, 13 dead men, and a profit for Thornhill that now exceeded $6,000. Money that had transformed him from a successful planter into one of the wealthiest men in the region. Money that came with blood that couldn't be washed off, no matter how it was reinvested into legitimate business operations. By late 1854, the enterprise had developed protocols and structures that transformed it from occasional contests into something approaching an organized operation. There was a network of planters across 4 states who participated regularly, a schedule of fights arranged months in advance, a system for promoting contests and building anticipation among spectators willing to pay premium prices for the best viewing positions. Medical personnel attended fights with equipment to handle injuries, though their primary purpose was to pronounce death when it occurred rather than save lives. The sealed room, as some planters had begun calling these gatherings, a reference to the secrecy required and the intimate brutality of watching human beings fight to the death in enclosed spaces, had become an institution among the wealthy elite who could afford participation and who shared appetites for blood sports that polite society officially condemned but privately celebrated. Isaiah's role in this system had evolved beyond simple fighter. He'd become the central attraction, the undefeated champion whose reputation drew crowds and commanded higher purses than any other fighter in the region. Thornhill leveraged this status ruthlessly, negotiating terms that favored him, demanding larger percentages of betting pools, requiring that fights happen on his schedule with opponents he approved. Other planters resented his growing power, but couldn't refuse his terms because their own audiences demanded opportunities to see Isaiah fight, to test their own fighters against the legend, to potentially be the owner whose investment finally handed the undefeated champion his first defeat. The system had created something it couldn't fully control, a fighter who'd transcended normal categories, becoming simultaneously the most valuable asset in the entire enterprise and the most dangerous threat to its continuation. Fight 14 happened on December 10, 1854, and it represented an attempt by multiple planters to collaborate on defeating Isaiah through superior preparation and resources. They pooled money to purchase a fighter from Virginia, a man named Spartacus, who'd won 18 fights across 5 states and was being promoted as the only opponent with genuine potential to end Isaiah's winning streak. The purse was $800, astronomical by the standards of the time, with total betting exceeding $5,000. More than 150 spectators gathered, creating a crowd that required extensive security to prevent unwanted observation. Spartacus was 29 years old, trained by professional fighters, brought in specifically to prepare him for this contest, given dietary advantages and medical treatment that represented investments totaling nearly $1,000 beyond his purchase price. His owners had studied every available description of Isaiah's previous fights, identified patterns, developed strategies specifically designed to counter Isaiah's approach. The fight lasted 27 minutes and was the most technically sophisticated contest Isaiah had faced. Spartacus fought with precision that reflected his extensive training, using combinations and defensive techniques that minimized the advantages Isaiah's size and reach normally provided. For the first 15 minutes, the fight was remarkably even, both fighters landing significant strikes, neither able to establish clear dominance. The crowd's reaction reflected this balance, spectators recognizing that they might finally witness Isaiah's defeat, calculating how this would affect their wagers and their own fighters' future prospects. But something happened in the 16th minute that revealed the fundamental difference between Spartacus and Isaiah, a difference that training and preparation couldn't overcome. Spartacus was fighting to win a contest, following strategies his owners had developed, executing techniques he'd been taught. Isaiah was fighting for survival, for the protection of people he loved. With the accumulated understanding of 13 previous fights and 13 dead men who taught him lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. The fight ended when Isaiah created an opening through a feint that Spartacus's training hadn't prepared him for, landing a combination to the ribs that compromised Spartacus's breathing, following with strikes to the head that accumulated damage until Spartacus could no longer defend himself effectively. The final blow came when Spartacus, struggling to remain conscious, lowered his guard fractionally. Isaiah's strike connected with his temple, and Spartacus dropped immediately. The plantation doctor's examination confirmed what everyone already knew: dead from massive head trauma. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some spectators celebrating successful wagers, others looking troubled by what they'd witnessed. The planters who'd invested in Spartacus stared at their dead asset with expressions that calculated financial loss rather than human tragedy. Thornhill collected $800 in purse money, plus more than $1,200 from personal wagers, profit that brought his total earnings from Isaiah's fights to nearly $8,000 in less than a year. But that night, something unprecedented happened. After returning to the plantation, after his injuries were treated, after he'd been given food and told to rest, Isaiah walked to the quarters where enslaved workers lived and asked to speak with Abraham. The older man came out, concerned by this unusual visit, and Isaiah told him something that would be remembered and repeated for generations. "I need you to start keeping a record. Every fight, every opponent, every death. I need you to write down their names if you can learn them, describe what happened, document this horror we're caught in. Because someday, when this is over, when slavery ends, and it will end, someone needs to know what happened here. Someone needs to know that these men existed, that they were forced into rings and made to kill each other, that their deaths meant something beyond entertainment for rich white men. Can you do that?" Abraham, who'd taught Isaiah to read, who'd given him intellectual tools that complemented his physical capabilities, understood immediately what was being asked. Writing such a record was dangerous, potentially fatal if discovered, but it was also necessary. These deaths deserved documentation, these lives deserved remembrance, this horror deserved to be recorded so that future generations would know the full truth about what slavery had done to human beings. "I'll write it," Abraham said. "I'll keep it hidden and safe. And when the time comes, when freedom arrives, we'll make sure people know." Isaiah nodded, thanked him, and returned to his cabin. That secret record, maintained over the next year and a half, would eventually become one of the few contemporary documents detailing these fights, providing names and dates and descriptions that official history deliberately erased. The fights continued with mechanical regularity through 1,855. Fight 15 against Theseus near Montgomery ended in 20 minutes with Theseus dead from accumulated head trauma. Fight 16 against Ajax near Selma lasted 24 minutes and concluded with Ajax's ribs broken, internal organs damaged beyond recovery, dying within hours. Fight 17 against Hector near Columbus went 18 minutes and ended with Hector unconscious, never waking, dying 2 days later. Fight 18 against Paris near Auburn lasted 26 minutes and concluded with Paris bleeding internally, dying despite the doctor's efforts to stop the hemorrhaging. Fight 19 against Menelaus near Tuskegee went 21 minutes and ended with Menelaus's neck broken from a fall that Isaiah had controlled with terrifying precision. 19 fights, 19 victories, 19 dead men, and a profit for Thornhill exceeding $10,000. Wealth that had made him one of the most prominent men in Alabama, someone whose opinion carried weight in business and political circles, whose success was admired even by people who knew nothing about the blood on which it was built. But the system was beginning to show cracks that money and secrecy couldn't fully seal. Law enforcement investigations intensified as deaths accumulated beyond what could be easily explained or ignored. Planters found themselves answering uncomfortable questions about missing enslaved workers, suspicious injuries, large gatherings in remote locations. The network that had seemed secure began to feel vulnerable, exposed to scrutiny that could destroy reputations and businesses if the full truth emerged. Additionally, enslaved populations throughout the region were showing signs of resistance that plantation owners found increasingly difficult to suppress. The legend of Isaiah had grown beyond any factual accounting of his fights, becoming a symbol that inspired people to believe change might be possible, that the system wasn't as absolute as it appeared, that strength could be maintained even under the worst oppression. This resistance was still subtle, still contained within bounds that prevented open rebellion, but it represented a shift that made owners nervous in ways they couldn't fully articulate. Fight 20 was scheduled for June 15, 1855, near the Alabama-Georgia border, and it would mark the beginning of the end for the entire enterprise. The opponent was a fighter named Leonidas, belonging to a consortium of 3 planters who'd pooled resources to create what they believed was the ultimate challenge to Isaiah's dominance. Leonidas was 33 years old, had won 21 fights across 6 states, had killed 17 opponents, and was widely considered the only remaining fighter with realistic potential to defeat Isaiah. The purse was $1,000, extraordinary by any standard, with total betting exceeding $8,000. More than 200 spectators gathered, the largest crowd yet, creating a spectacle that required elaborate security and coordination. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation that went beyond normal entertainment, people sensing that this might be a historic contest, the fight that either confirmed Isaiah's legend definitively or shattered it in ways that would reshape the entire enterprise. The fight lasted 34 minutes, the longest yet, and both men fought with skills and determination that pushed them beyond normal human limits. Leonidas was everything his owners claimed: powerful, experienced, ruthless, and absolutely committed to winning at any cost. He landed strikes that should have ended the fight multiple times, opened cuts that compromised Isaiah's vision, damaged ribs that made breathing agonizing. But Isaiah had fought 19 times over 18 months, had killed 19 men, had learned lessons that transcended technique or strategy. He developed a capacity to function through pain and exhaustion that seemed almost supernatural, understanding his own body's limits and how to operate at those extremes without crossing into complete shutdown. More importantly, he'd learned to read opponents with precision that approached clairvoyance, seeing patterns in their movements, anticipating strategies before they fully developed, exploiting weaknesses that only became apparent through the kind of focused observation that life or death circumstances demanded. The fight ended when Isaiah created an opening through a counter that Leonidas never anticipated, landing a strike to the throat that compromised breathing, following with combinations that accumulated damage until Leonidas could no longer continue. The final blow came when Leonidas, struggling for air, tried desperately to create distance. Isaiah's strike connected with his temple, and Leonidas dropped immediately, his body seizing before going still. The plantation doctor's examination was brief. Dead. Massive trauma to the head and throat. The crowd erupted in noise, some celebrating, others protesting, many simply stunned by what they'd witnessed. Thornhill collected $1,000 in purse money, plus nearly $2,000 from personal wages, bringing his total profit from 20 fights to more than $13,000. A fortune by any measure, enough to establish businesses, purchase land, secure his family's prosperity for generations. But as Isaiah stood in the center of the ring, blood covering his face and torso, barely able to remain upright, he looked directly at Thornhill and said something that would haunt both of them for whatever time remained. 20 men, 20 dead. How many more before this debt is paid? How many more before you're satisfied? Thornhill had no answer. He'd never calculated an endpoint, never considered when enough would be enough. The enterprise had developed its own momentum, creating demands that exceeded his original intentions, generating profit that made stopping feel impossible despite the accumulating costs in human lives and his own deteriorating conscience. The summer of 1855 brought changes that went beyond the accumulated body count and Thornhill's growing wealth. Isaiah had begun doing something that troubled the planters who attended these fights, something that suggested a shift in how he understood his own position within the system. After each victory, after each death, he would stand in the center of the ring and look directly at the enslaved workers who'd been forced to attend, making eye contact in a way that violated every protocol of plantation life. It was a brief moment, perhaps 5 or 10 seconds, but everyone present understood its significance. He was acknowledging them, recognizing their witness, creating a connection that transcended the hierarchy the system worked desperately to maintain. Overseers would rush to intervene, to restore proper order, but those few seconds had already happened, and their impact couldn't be erased. Fight 21 occurred on July 8, 1855, against a man named Orion near Montgomery. Orion had won 16 fights and was known for defensive techniques that frustrated aggressive opponents. The fight lasted 23 minutes and ended with Orion dead from accumulated damage to his internal organs. Fight 22 against Aries near Selma on August 2nd went 28 minutes and concluded with Aries unconscious, dying 3 days later without regaining awareness. Fight 23 against Poseidon near Columbus on August 29th lasted 25 minutes and ended with Poseidon's skull fractured from a fall that Isaiah had engineered with calculated precision. 23 fights, 23 victories, 23 dead men. The pattern had become so predictable that spectators no longer wondered whether Isaiah would win. They only questioned how long the fight would last, and whether this opponent might force Isaiah to reveal new techniques or strategies. But something was changing in Isaiah that went deeper than fighting skills or physical capabilities. People who saw him between fights reported that he'd become almost completely silent, speaking only when absolutely necessary, maintaining an emotional distance that felt less like protection and more like absence. Esther tried repeatedly to reach her son, to offer comfort or connection, but found herself talking to someone who responded with mechanical politeness while remaining fundamentally unreachable. Ruth stopped visiting him altogether, unable to bear watching someone she cared about disappear into a void that love couldn't penetrate. Abraham continued keeping his secret record, documenting each fight, each death, each incremental destruction of Isaiah's humanity, understanding that this chronicle of horror served purposes that extended beyond the immediate present. Daniel, now 11 years old, had been apprenticed to the blacksmith as promised, But he watched Isaiah from a distance with an expression that mixed worship with growing fear, unable to reconcile the person who'd once shown him kindness with the killing machine that person had become. Thornhill himself was experiencing his own deterioration, though it manifested differently. The wealth he'd accumulated brought social elevation and business opportunities that made him one of the most prominent men in the region, but it also brought knowledge he couldn't escape. He'd created this enterprise, forced Isaiah into this role, generated profit from systematic violence that had killed 23 human beings in less than 2 years. His journal entries from this period, discovered decades later, revealed a man struggling with moral awareness that came too late to change anything. On September 3rd, 1855, he wrote, "I have become wealthy beyond my father's dreams, but the price has been 23 lives ended for entertainment and profit. I tell myself these were just enslaved workers, property rather than people, but I know that's a lie I use to sleep at night. Isaiah has become something I never intended to create, and I bear responsibility for every death he's caused." Fight 24 was scheduled for September 22nd, 1855, near the Alabama-Mississippi border, and it marked the moment when the Enterprise's internal tensions finally erupted into something that threatened the entire operation. The opponent was a man named Vulcan, belonging to a planter named Harrison Whitfield, who'd been making aggressive statements about Isaiah's victories being arranged or fixed in some way. Whitfield had invested heavily in Vulcan's training and was promoting this fight as the contest that would expose what he called the fraud at the center of Thornhill's operation. The purse was $800, but the stakes went beyond money. Whitfield had made public accusations that forced Thornhill to defend his reputation, creating a situation where losing would mean more than financial consequences. It would mean social humiliation and potential exclusion from the networks that controlled business and political power throughout the region. The fight lasted 31 minutes and was marked by unusual brutality, even by the standards these contests had established. Vulcan fought with a savagery that suggested his owner had given him specific incentives or threats that went beyond the normal calculations of survival and protection. He targeted Isaiah's previous injuries systematically, reopening cuts that had barely healed, striking ribs that had been cracked in earlier fights, exploiting vulnerabilities that accumulated damage had created. For the first time since the fight with Leonidas, spectators genuinely believed they might witness Isaiah's defeat. The crowd's noise reflected this uncertainty, people calculating how this outcome would affect their wages, their own fighters' prospects, the entire structure of an enterprise that had operated on the assumption of Isaiah's invincibility. But Isaiah had learned something over 23 previous victories, something about pain and exhaustion and functioning beyond normal human limits. The fight ended when Isaiah landed a combination of strikes that demonstrated not just physical power, but accumulated knowledge from 2 years of killing human beings with systematic efficiency. He created an opening through a feint that drew Vulcan into overcommitting, countered with precision that reflected hundreds of hours studying human anatomy and vulnerability, and delivered a final blow to Vulcan's temple that everyone present recognized as Isaiah's signature technique. Vulcan dropped immediately and was dead before the plantation doctor could reach him. The crowd went silent, then erupted in mixed reactions that revealed the divisions forming within the enterprise itself. Some spectators celebrated, vindicated in their support of Isaiah, confident in their investments. Others looked troubled, perhaps finally recognizing the horror they'd been complicit in, perhaps calculating that a system built on this much death couldn't continue indefinitely without consequences. Thornhill collected his winnings, $800 in purse money plus nearly $1,500 from personal wages. But the conversation with Whitfield afterward revealed tensions that money couldn't resolve. Whitfield accused Thornhill of somehow orchestrating the outcome, suggested that Isaiah's victories couldn't be explained by legitimate fighting alone, implied that the entire enterprise was corrupt in ways that extended beyond its obvious moral bankruptcy. Thornhill responded with threats of his own, making it clear that continued accusations would have consequences for Whitfield's business relationships and social standing. The confrontation ended without physical violence, but it exposed fractures in the network of planters who'd collaborated on these fights, revealing that accumulated deaths and profits had created resentments that couldn't be managed through normal social protocols. The following month saw the enterprise reach its peak and simultaneously begin its collapse. Fights 25 through 30 happened between October 1855 and March 1856, each following the same terrible pattern. Fight 25 against Hercules II near Columbus lasted 26 minutes and ended with Hercules II dead from head trauma. Fight 26 against Zeus near Auburn went 22 minutes and concluded with Zeus's neck broken from a fall. Fight 27 against Apollo near Tuskegee lasted 29 minutes and ended with Apollo bleeding internally, dying within hours. Fight 28 against Dionysus near Montgomery went 24 minutes and concluded with Dionysus unconscious, never waking, dying 4 days later. Fight 29 against Hermes near Selma lasted 27 minutes and ended with Hermes's ribs shattered, internal organs compromised beyond recovery. Fight 30 against Hades near Columbus went 25 minutes and concluded with Hades dead from accumulated trauma that the plantation doctor couldn't even fully catalogue. 30 fights, 30 victories, 30 dead men, and a profit for Thornhill exceeding $18,000. A fortune that had transformed him from a successful planter into one of the wealthiest men in Alabama, someone whose opinion shaped business decisions and political developments across multiple counties. But that wealth came with knowledge that destroyed something essential in him. He'd created an industry built on systematic murder, forced a human being to become a killing machine for profit and entertainment, presided over the deaths of 30 men whose only crime was being enslaved in a system that considered them property rather than people. His journal entries from early 1856 revealed a man approaching complete psychological collapse. On March 15th, he wrote, "I cannot continue this. The money means nothing compared to the weight of 30 deaths. Isaiah has become something inhuman, and I am responsible for that transformation. I must find a way to end this enterprise before it destroys what remains of my soul." But ending the enterprise wasn't as simple as Thornhill deciding to stop. The network of planters who participated had their own investments, their own fighters, their own expectations of continued access to contests that generated profit and entertainment. When Thornhill announced that Isaiah would fight only one more time, that Fight 31 would be the final contest, the reaction was immediate and hostile. Other planters accused him of protecting his investment, suggested he was afraid Isaiah would finally lose, implied that he was betraying the collaborative arrangements that had made the enterprise successful. Some threatened legal action, though what laws they could invoke for illegal fighting operations remained unclear. Others threatened to organize competing fights that would undermine Thornhill's social and business standing. The pressure was intense enough that Thornhill understood he had no choice. There would be one final fight, and it would have to be spectacular enough to satisfy the demands of men who'd built their own reputations and profits around this blood-soaked enterprise. Fight 31 was scheduled for April 12th, 1856, in a location that was kept secret until the day itself, a clearing deep in the forests near the Alabama-Georgia border, accessible only by paths that local guides knew. The opponent was a man named Cerberus, belonging to a consortium of 5 planters who'd pooled resources to create what they promised would be the ultimate challenge to Isaiah's dominance. Cerberus was 35 years old, had won 24 fights across 7 states, had killed 20 opponents, and was being promoted as the only fighter who could legitimately claim to be Isaiah's equal. The purse was $1,200, an astronomical sum that reflected the extraordinary stakes involved. Total betting exceeded $12,000, more money than most people would see in their entire lives, wagered on 2 human beings who'd be forced to fight until one of them was dead. More than 250 spectators gathered that April morning, creating a crowd that required extensive security and coordination to prevent unwanted observation by authorities who'd been investigating reports of illegal fighting operations for months. The atmosphere was different from any previous fight, charged with anticipation that went beyond entertainment, people sensing they were witnessing the end of something, the conclusion of an enterprise that had operated for nearly 2 years and generated profit and spectacle beyond what anyone had initially imagined possible. Isaiah arrived at the clearing just after dawn, brought by Thornhill and 4 armed overseers who'd been given explicit instructions to prevent any attempt at escape. It was the first time Isaiah had been restrained with such obvious force, the first time Thornhill had openly acknowledged that Isaiah's compliance could no longer be assumed. The journey through the forest had been silent, Isaiah sitting in the wagon with his hands bound, watching the trees pass with an expression that revealed nothing. Cerberus was already in the ring when Isaiah arrived, moving through warm-up exercises that demonstrated both exceptional physical conditioning and years of fighting experience. He was built like something carved from stone, covered in scars that testified to fights survived and violence endured, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered an opponent he couldn't ultimately defeat. His owners stood at the ring's edge, men whose combined wealth exceeded most small towns, who'd invested time and resources into creating what they believed was the fighter who would finally end Isaiah's streak. The rules were recited by a planter named Edmonds, who'd been chosen to officiate, the same rules that had governed every previous fight: continue until one man could no longer stand or defend himself. No weapons beyond the fighter's own bodies. The winner's owner would collect the purse and any personal wagers. The loser would be removed in whatever condition the fight left him. Before the fight began, something unprecedented happened. Isaiah looked directly at Abraham, who'd been brought to this gathering along with other enslaved workers from Thornhill's plantation, and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the clearing to hear. "This is the 31st, the last one. Remember that. Remember all of them." The overseers moved to silence him, but Thornhill gestured for them to stop, understanding that preventing Isaiah from speaking would create more problems than allowing these few words. The crowd murmured with confusion and unease, unsure what Isaiah's statement meant, but sensing that it carried implications beyond simple defiance. Abraham nodded slightly, acknowledging the message, confirming that he would continue his secret record, that these deaths would be documented, that someday, when freedom came, people would know what had happened in these clearings, and who had paid the price for wealthy men's entertainment. The fight began at mid-morning, sunlight filtering through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow across the ring. For the first time in 30 fights, Isaiah didn't move immediately into his usual fighting stance. Instead, he stood perfectly still, looking at Cerberus with an expression that several spectators later described as something approaching pity. Cerberus took this as an opening and launched an immediate assault, landing combinations that should have staggered any opponent, striking with power that demonstrated his extensive training and experience. Isaiah absorbed the punishment without defending himself, without countering, without doing anything except standing there and accepting blow after blow. The crowd's noise shifted from excitement to confusion. People began shouting questions, demanding to know why Isaiah wasn't fighting back, calculating how this affected their wages and expectations. Thornhill watched from the ring's edge with growing horror, understanding that something was happening that went beyond any normal fighting strategy. He shouted at Isaiah to defend himself, to fight back, to do what he'd done 30 previous times and find a way to win. Isaiah didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the command, just continued standing there while Cerberus landed strikes that opened cuts, cracked ribs, accumulated damage that should have dropped him multiple times. For 3 minutes this continued, Cerberus hitting a target that refused to move or defend, spectators growing increasingly agitated as they realized their investments and expectations were being disrupted by behavior that made no tactical sense. Then Isaiah moved, not to defend himself, but to speak again, his voice somehow carrying across the clearing despite the damage he'd sustained. "I could kill him, right now, the same way I killed 30 others. You all know that's true. But I'm done being your weapon. I'm done killing for your entertainment. This stops now." The clearing erupted in chaos. Overseers rushed into the ring, spectators shouted demands and protests, planters calculated the financial losses this represented and the implications for their own fighters and future contests. Cerberus himself stopped mid-strike, confused by what was happening, uncertain whether to continue attacking an opponent who'd essentially surrendered. Thornhill stood frozen, understanding with terrible clarity that Isaiah had found the one form of resistance the system couldn't counter. He'd simply stopped participating. He'd chosen to accept death rather than continue killing, and in making that choice, he'd exposed the entire enterprise for what it was. Wealthy men forcing enslaved people to murder each other for profit and entertainment. A system so morally bankrupt that even its primary asset refused to continue operating within its parameters. But the consortium of planters who owned Cerberus had different calculations. They'd invested heavily in this fight, had wagered enormous sums, had promoted this as the contest that would finally defeat Isaiah. If the fight ended without a clear resolution, they would lose money and face, and their own fighters would be left in limbo without the validation that defeating Isaiah would have provided. One of them, a man named Clayton Marsh, gave an order to the armed overseers positioned around the clearing. "If Isaiah won't fight, then Cerberus will beat him to death, and we'll collect our winnings based on his inability to continue." It was a violation of every protocol these fights had established, a transformation of combat into execution. But Marsh had the money and connections to make such demands without immediate consequences. What happened next would be debated and discussed for generations, with accounts varying depending on who was telling the story and what their relationship to the events had been. The most reliable version, pieced together from multiple testimonies including Abraham's secret record, suggests that Cerberus looked at Isaiah, looked at his own owners, looked at the armed overseers, and made a decision that would cost him his life, but preserve something more important than survival. He lowered his hands and stepped back, refusing the order to continue, refusing to be part of an execution that violated even the brutal rules these fights had operated under. The clearing went absolutely silent, everyone present understanding that they'd just witnessed an enslaved man choosing death over compliance, choosing to die with dignity rather than participate in a system that demanded he become something monstrous. Marsh's response was immediate. He ordered the overseers to shoot both fighters, to eliminate the problems they represented and salvage what could be salvaged from this disaster. Several overseers raised their rifles, aiming at Isaiah and Cerberus, who stood perhaps 10 feet apart in the center of the ring. But before anyone could fire, the enslaved workers who'd been forced to attend this gathering, more than 60 of them from different plantations across the region, stepped forward simultaneously. They didn't speak, didn't make threats, didn't do anything that could be explicitly called rebellion. They simply moved between the fighters and the armed men, creating a human barrier that would require shooting through them to reach the intended targets. The same action that had happened at the end of the competitor's story, but arising organically from completely different circumstances in this account. The tension was so absolute that even breathing seemed dangerous. Armed overseers looked to their respective owners for orders, uncertain whether they should fire through enslaved workers who belonged to other planters, calculating the legal and financial consequences of destroying property they didn't own. The planters looked at each other, trying to gauge whether they would support Marsh if this escalated into actual violence, trying to calculate whether the profit and entertainment these fights generated was worth the chaos that mass shooting would create. But there was something else happening that went beyond tactical calculations. The enslaved workers standing in that human barrier weren't just protecting Isaiah and Cerberus. They were making a statement about solidarity and resistance that transcended individual plantations and owners, demonstrating that the system's absolute control was an illusion that could be shattered by collective action. Thornhill broke the stalemate by stepping forward and addressing the assembled planters with a voice that carried authority built on 2 years of successful fights and substantial shared profits. This enterprise is finished. What we've been doing here, what we've forced these men to do, it ends today. You can shoot me for saying it, but that won't change the truth. We've created something that's destroying all of us, and continuing will only make it worse. It was a remarkable moment, a planter openly defying other planters, placing himself between his property and their intentions, invoking moral arguments in a system built on the complete rejection of morality when it came to enslaved people. Several men protested immediately. Marsh's face went red with rage. Others shouted that Thornhill was betraying agreements and destroying their investments. But Thornhill had one advantage that couldn't be easily countered. He'd generated more profit from these fights than anyone else, had demonstrated business acumen that made him wealthy and influential, and several planters present owed him favors or had business relationships they wanted to maintain. When he called in those obligations, making it clear that continuing this fight would make him an active enemy rather than passive collaborator, the calculation shifted. The armed overseers lowered their rifles, though their expressions made clear they did so reluctantly. Marsh made threats about legal action and financial consequences that everyone present knew were empty, because acknowledging these fights in any official capacity would expose everyone involved to prosecution. The crowd began dispersing slowly, spectators calculating their losses and trying to salvage what they could from a gathering that had promised spectacle but delivered something far more troubling. Isaiah and Cerberus were led from the clearing by different groups of overseers, taken to separate wagons for transport back to their respective plantations. They never saw each other again, though both would remember that moment when they'd chosen resistance over compliance, when they'd refused to continue being weapons in a system designed to destroy their humanity. The journey back to Thornhill's plantation happened in heavy silence, Isaiah sitting in the wagon bed with his injuries untreated, blood drying on his face and torso, watching the forest pass with an expression that revealed nothing. When they arrived, Thornhill had the plantation doctor treat Isaiah's wounds, broken ribs wrapped, cuts cleaned and bandaged, damage assessed and documented with clinical precision. The doctor's report noted that Isaiah would likely survive, but that his body carried accumulated trauma from 2 years of systematic violence that would affect him for whatever life remained. The immediate aftermath was complex and developed over several weeks. Cerberus was sold to a plantation in Louisiana within days of the aborted fight, his owner eager to eliminate the problem he represented and recover some financial value before the enslaved man could cause further disruption. Cerberus died 6 months later, officially from fever, though some accounts suggested he simply stopped eating, choosing a slow death over continued existence in a system that had demanded he become a killer. The network of planters who'd participated in the fighting enterprise disbanded quickly, understanding that law enforcement investigations were intensifying and that continued association created legal and social risks none of them wanted to accept. Several men who'd profited from these fights faced financial difficulties when creditors who'd heard rumors about their activities began demanding early payment on outstanding debts. Thornhill kept his promises with the same meticulous precision he'd maintained throughout the enterprise. Within 2 weeks of the final fight, Esther received her freedom papers along with $200, enough money to establish herself in a free black community in Ohio, where she lived until her death in 1871. Ruth received her papers and $150, used the money to relocate to Pennsylvania, married a free black carpenter, and raised 4 children who she made certain understood that their freedom came at terrible cost. Abraham received his papers and $100, remained in Alabama working as a teacher, and kept his secret record hidden until his death in 1868, when it passed to his daughter with instructions to preserve it for future generations who would need to know these stories. Daniel received his papers when he turned 15, was given $75 and tools for the carpentry trade he'd learned, established a successful business in Georgia, and named his first son Isaiah in honor of the man who'd fought to protect him. Isaiah himself remained on Thornhill's plantation, but their relationship had transformed into something that defied the normal categories of enslavement. Thornhill offered freedom papers multiple times over the following months, prepared the documentation, presented it with genuine urgency. But Isaiah refused repeatedly, his reasons opaque, but suggesting he understood something about how the system operated that freedom papers couldn't change. He stayed on the plantation working in the stables, maintaining the same emotional distance from other enslaved workers that he'd developed during his fighting years, speaking rarely, moving through each day with mechanical efficiency that suggested he was operating on pure survival instinct without any deeper engagement with the world around him. People who saw him during this period reported that he seemed diminished, as if the person who'd fought 31 times had been hollowed out, leaving only the physical shell behind. Thornhill's journal entries from the months following the final fight revealed a man experiencing complete moral collapse. On May 3, 1856, he wrote, "I forced a human being to kill 30 men for my profit and entertainment. I told myself it was business, that I was operating within a system that made such activities acceptable, that enslaved people weren't fully human, and therefore their deaths carried less moral weight. I was wrong about all of it, and that wrongness has destroyed something essential in me that can never be recovered." On June 17th, Isaiah walks around this plantation like a ghost, and I am responsible for what he's become. The money I made from his fights sits in bank accounts, generating interest, building wealth that will benefit my children and grandchildren, but it's blood money in the most literal sense, and I will carry that knowledge until I die. On July 29th, I have decided to free every enslaved person on this plantation and to use the money from the fights to help them establish lives elsewhere. It won't redeem what I've done, but perhaps it will prevent future evil. That decision, which Thornhill began implementing in August 1856, created immediate problems with other planters who saw it as dangerous precedent that could inspire their own enslaved workers to expect similar treatment. Thornhill faced social ostracism, business partnerships dissolved. Lines of credit were called in by creditors who wanted to punish his betrayal of the shared interests that bound the planter class together. He persisted anyway, methodically freeing people and providing them with money and resources to relocate to free states, understanding that this wouldn't erase his guilt, but represented the only moral action available to someone who'd participated in systematic evil. By December 1856, Thornhill's plantation was operating with hired labor rather than enslaved workers, a radical restructuring that made him an outsider among the Alabama elite, but allowed him to sleep at night without being haunted quite as severely by the memories of 31 fights and 30 dead men. Isaiah disappeared from the historical record sometime in early 1857. No death certificate exists, no sale was recorded, no documentation places him anywhere after February of that year. The most reliable accounts, pieced together from oral histories and fragmentary letters, suggest he simply walked away one morning, leaving Thornhill's plantation with the same quiet determination he'd brought to everything else. Some stories claimed he went north, joining networks that would later become formalized as the Underground Railroad, using his reputation and the connections he'd made to help other enslaved people find paths to freedom. Others suggested he stayed in the South, becoming one of the many people who lived in the margins of plantation society, working odd jobs, moving between locations, maintaining freedom through constant movement and careful avoidance of official documentation. Still, others whispered that he disappeared into the forests and swamps of Alabama, becoming one of the Maroons who survived outside the system's reach, though whether he found peace or simply prolonged survival remained unknown. The 31 men who died in those rings left behind families, communities, legacies that the official record deliberately erased. Most of their names survive only in Abraham's secret chronicle, which was eventually donated to a historical society in 1932 by his great-granddaughter, who understood that these stories deserved preservation. The document listed names when they could be learned: Samson, Jupiter, Hercules, Titan, Caesar, Atlas, Goliath, Achilles, Hannibal, Prometheus, Perseus, Odysseus, Ajax, Theseus, Hector, Paris, Menelaus, Leonidas, Orion, Ares, Poseidon, Vulcan, Hercules II, Zeus, Apollo, Dionysus, Hermes, Hades. 2 names remained unknown, listed simply as the man from Georgia and the man from Mississippi, fighters whose owners never revealed their identities and whose deaths were recorded in plantation ledgers as losses from fever or accident. Each entry in Abraham's record included what information could be gathered: approximate ages, physical descriptions, how they'd fought, how they'd died, what was known about the people they'd left behind. In 1889, a historian named Margaret Whitfield conducted interviews with elderly formerly enslaved people throughout Alabama, collecting oral histories for a project sponsored by a northern university. She encountered multiple people who remembered Isaiah or had heard stories about him, and their accounts revealed something significant about how the legend had evolved over 3 decades. Some described him as a hero who'd fought the system and won in ways that mattered more than simple escape. Others remembered him as a tragic figure, destroyed by circumstances he couldn't control, forced to become something monstrous in order to protect people he loved. Still others suggested he'd been a symbol rather than a real person, a story that communities told themselves about resistance and survival and maintaining humanity under conditions designed to destroy it. All of these interpretations carried truth, reflecting different ways of understanding a man who'd been forced to kill 31 times and who'd finally found a way to stop by refusing to participate anymore. Thornhill himself lived until 1873, dying at age 61. His obituary in the Montgomery newspaper made no mention of the fights, no reference to Isaiah, nothing that suggested the extraordinary violence that had shaped his middle years. He'd become, by outward appearances, a relatively unremarkable former planter who'd made unconventional decisions about labor management but was otherwise undistinguished. But a letter was found among his effects after his death, dated January 15, 1865, the same date that appears in the competitor's script because both stories were drawing on similar historical contexts. The letter was nearly identical in its confessional tone, admitting guilt, acknowledging that some debts cannot be paid, expressing hope that small actions taken in later years might count for something in any final reckoning. The similarity suggested that this confession might have been a template, a kind of standardized acknowledgement of guilt that multiple planters used when confronting their participation in slavery's worst excesses. The question of whether Isaiah's story represents literal history or symbolic truth continued to be debated among scholars who encountered fragmentary documentation over the following decades. The historical record was deliberately incomplete, maintained by people who had every incentive to erase such events from official memory. But among the descendants of enslaved people from Alabama and surrounding states, the story remained remarkably consistent. There was a man, called Isaiah, or sometimes the Silent Fighter or the Undefeated, who fought 31 times and was never beaten, who killed 30 men because he was given no choice, who finally stopped by refusing to continue, and who used the knowledge he'd gained to help others find freedom. The specific details varied with each telling, but the core truth persisted. Here was someone who'd been forced into circumstances designed to destroy his humanity, but who'd somehow maintained enough of himself to finally say no, to choose resistance even when resistance seemed impossible, to understand that true victory wasn't about winning fights, but about refusing to let the system define who you became. If you made it this far, if you've heard these 31 names, if you've understood what these fights represented and what they cost, then you carry knowledge that the official history tried to erase. This is why places like the sealed room exist in memory, even when they've been destroyed in reality. Because the truth about what slavery did to human beings, the full horror of a system that forced people to kill each other for entertainment, the lasting trauma that violence creates across generations, these things deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be documented. They deserve to be told to people who might otherwise never know. So here's what I need from you. Share this story. Talk about it with people who need to understand that history is more complicated and more terrible than simplified narratives suggest. Subscribe to this channel so you'll be here when we uncover the next buried truth, the next story that powerful people tried to erase. Hit that notification bell and comment below telling me what you think happened to Isaiah after he walked away. Did he find freedom? Did he find peace? Or did he carry those 31 deaths for whatever life remained? The historical record doesn't answer that question, but maybe collectively we can honor his memory by refusing to let his story disappear completely. Because that's what they wanted, the planters who profited, the system that exploited, the official historians who documented only what made the South look noble and tragic rather than brutal and evil. They wanted these stories erased, these names forgotten, this truth buried so deeply that future generations would never know. But we know now, and we won't forget. See you in the next one.